something on my mind recently. Let's talk about leadership and grit, specifically in the context of the Vancouver Canucks and Jake Virtanen. Now, I'm bringing this up because Jim Benning, earlier on Sportsnet 650, he had a little bit of a quote talking about Jake Virtanen. He says, "Every year he shows improvement, and getting Michael Ferland will be good for Jake. Watching Michael and how physically he plays will be beneficial for Virtanen." And for the most part, I kind of agree. This is a very fair statement, and I think it's something that begs the question on just how far Jake Virtanen is able to develop going forward into his NHL career. Virtanen is 22 years old. He's turning 23 in August, drafted in the 2014 NHL entry draft, the very first draft pick that Jim Benning ever made for the Vancouver Canucks, 6th overall Jake Virtanen. Obviously, people know about Virtanen, William Nylander, Nikolai Ehlers, these guys went later. What's up with Virtanen? Yada, yada, yada. He was supposed to be a big power forward. What's up? Why is he not translating? Jake Virtanen has been roughly at a 20-25 point pace throughout the past few years that he's played NHL hockey. On top of that, he's had roughly around 40-ish penalty minutes each year, and this is not something that a lot of people were really expecting. People were expecting a little bit more of a more stable and accelerated development, especially for a 6th overall pick. Bring in Michael Ferland, a guy who plays a very rough physical style of game similar to the way Virtanen would play with the Calgary Hitmen, a guy who got himself 40 points in the past few seasons in the NHL and posted up 58 penalty minutes last year. Ferland is a guy who's a big body who loves to run around and hit people, and Jake Virtanen is a guy who, you could argue, his big edge for hitting people has kind of gone astray. Jake Virtanen, when he was drafted, he was a point-per-game player for the Calgary Hitmen, and he had 100 penalty minutes in 71 games played. That's definitely indicative of a huge power forward-like player, and that's why a lot of people were saying, when we drafted Virtanen, hey, this guy could be the next Bertuzzi. And sure, Bertuzzi didn't really develop into the Bertuzzi we know and love today until he was in his 22, 23, 24-year-old seasons. So obviously Virtanen, putting the expectations of him becoming a player like that immediately were a little bit off, but the point still remains that Jake Virtanen has not necessarily been accelerating throughout the NHL at a rate that the majority of Canucks fans would be satisfied with. And having a guy like Ferland who has this quality to his game that people saw in Virtanen in the past really does show that, hey, there is a big opportunity for that leadership to carry over into the game of Jake Virtanen next season. Now, I'm not the guy who's been the most positive in terms of Jake Virtanen talk. I've made a video way before I went on my first hiatus, before I became relevant on YouTube, a few years ago, saying, what if the Canucks didn't draft Virtanen? And that was more of a, hey, what if they got Nylander or Ehlers? And I just talked about the offensive possibilities there. But the fact of the matter is, Jake Virtanen was never necessarily drafted to be better than those players. Virtanen was drafted in the same reason that Benning and co. drafted Podkolzin, because they wanted a big, powerful difference maker on the ice who couldn't only get points, but who could establish a really strong physical presence as well. And having a guy like Ferland, who they brought in to have that exact same purpose, does give me hope that Virtanen will be able to get himself over that hump, get 20 goals, get 50 points, get upwards of 60, 70 penalty minutes, and really just establish himself as a really strong-minded NHL player. Because throughout the past few years, Virtanen has been in a position where he's been kind of lost out there. He brings out the big hits once in a while. I mean, he did get 40 penalty minutes last season, but he's not necessarily somebody who exhibits the strongest hockey IQ out there and the strongest potential when it comes to the game that he plays. He's so fast and he's so good at bringing the puck in himself, but he just doesn't know what else to do after that. But a guy like Ferland kind of does. And we've seen that throughout the past few years. 20 goals back-to-back seasons. Ferland is a strong NHL player who exhibits a really strong style. And of course, he is 5 years older than Virtanen. I'm not going to act like 5 years is incredibly great, but 5 years is 5 years of hockey experience. And Ferland is certainly a guy who does have that experience. So if anything, I agree with betting on this, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Virtanen will be able to get from observing a guy like Ferland. And it's not just Ferland in general. Myers is a big body who can hit people. JT Miller is a guy who's really gritty as well. And overall, there's just a new establishment of grit amongst the team that I really think could benefit a guy like Virtanen, whose playstyle was primarily based upon grit back in junior, and whose grit hasn't really translated all too much throughout the past few years. Now, the subject of grit in its entirety in the Vancouver Canucks, that's a story for a different day. I'll maybe talk about that some other time, but for now, Jake Virtanen, I still think there's potential with this player, and I think Ferland is going to give a really good opportunity for Virtanen to unlock that potential. Hope you enjoyed this video. Social 99, and bye.